When 78-year-old Harold Whitmore cashed out his entire pension to buy a fleet of luxury cars, his neighbors thought he'd lost his mind. Harold had never owned a car in his life. He couldn't even drive. But the eccentric widower transformed his modest suburban lot into a surreal display of automotive splendor. Ferraris, Lamborghinis, and Rolls-Royces gleamed in his driveway. The reason for his extravagant purchases, however, was far more shocking than anyone could have imagined. Harold Whitmore's life was one of quiet simplicity. At 78, the retired school librarian lived in a modest home in a suburban cul-de-sac. His days were predictable. Mornings with a cup of tea by the window, afternoons tending his small garden, and evenings lost in books. This routine was his sanctuary, a steady rhythm in an unpredictable world. Widowed for over 20 years, Harold had grown accustomed to solitude. Margaret, his late wife, had been his anchor, and her passing left a void he filled with books and gardening. His only companions were the stray cats that visited his yard. Harold named them after literary characters, Oliver, Jane, and Pip, and they seemed to sense his gentle nature. Each morning they lounged on his porch as he poured them milk and scattered crumbs. Harold's home reflected his personality, modest but orderly. The front yard was lined with neatly trimmed marigolds and daisies, while the inside was dominated by bookshelves crammed with classics and encyclopedias. The scent of aged paper filled the air, a testament to the countless hours Harold spent immersed in stories. Visitors were rare, but those who entered often remarked on the warmth of the space, though Harold himself rarely shared it. Yet beneath his contentment, Harold sometimes felt a quiet yearning. He would gaze out the window at passing cars or pause to listen to the laughter of neighborhood children, wondering what might have been. His life had been one of stability, but the thought of missed opportunities occasionally lingered in the back of his mind. It was a question he avoided, until the morning an unusual letter arrived. Among his typical mail, a stack of bills and store flyers, was a thick envelope bearing the name of a law firm he didn't recognize. Curious, Harold set aside his tea and opened it. Inside was a letter from the estate of Albert Parker, a childhood friend he hadn't thought of in decades. Albert, the letter explained, had passed away, leaving Harold a significant inheritance. Accompanying the formal documents was a handwritten note. "Dear Harold, I always admired your quiet strength, but I often wondered if you let yourself dream. Use this gift to live a life without regret." Harold's hands trembled as he read the words. Memories of Albert flooded back, their boyhood adventures, their shared dreams, and the ways their lives had diverged. While Albert had chased adventure, Harold had chosen the safer road. The inheritance was substantial, far more than Harold could fathom spending. He sat in his favorite armchair staring at the letter. What did it mean to live without regret? Harold's life had been safe and predictable, but was that truly enough? For the rest of the day, Harold's thoughts churned. Travel? A new home? Something daring and unexpected? As the sun set over his quiet street, Harold stood at his window, watching the streetlights flicker on. A spark of curiosity stirred within him, faint but undeniable. His life, shaped by routine, was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The letter from Albert Parker sat on Harold's coffee table, its words echoing in his mind. Live a life without regret. For days, Harold avoided it, unsure of how to process the idea. The inheritance was immense, far more than he'd ever imagined, but the idea of spending it felt foreign to a man who had spent his life on modest means and quiet routines. Harold wasn't accustomed to luxury. Even during his years with Margaret, they had lived frugally, content with simple pleasures. Now, the idea that he could have whatever he wanted seemed absurd. What did Albert mean by living without regret? And what could Harold possibly want at this stage of his life? Seeking clarity, Harold ventured into his attic, a space he rarely entered. It was filled with memories. Margaret's belongings, dusty photo albums, and the odds and ends of a long, quiet life. Amid the clutter, Harold found an old journal. It was his, written during his teenage years. He flipped through its pages, smiling at the dreams of his younger self. One entry stood out: a plan to drive across the country in a vintage car, stopping at every state to explore landmarks and meet new people. Harold chuckled. He'd never even learned to drive. The journal stirred something in Harold. He thought about the life he had lived and the dreams he had quietly let go of. Albert's letter began to feel less like a gift and more like a challenge. Was it too late to rekindle that sense of adventure? The next day, Harold wandered into town. As he strolled past shop windows, he noticed a sleek red sports car outside a dealership. Its polished exterior gleamed in the sunlight, and Harold found himself drawn to it. He approached the window, marveling at its beauty. It was unlike anything he'd ever imagined owning. A young salesman stepped outside, smiling. "Beautiful, isn't it? That's a Ferrari 296 GTB. Harold nodded, captivated. "I've never driven a car before," he admitted, feeling slightly foolish. The salesman chuckled. "Well, you're never too old to start. Cars like this aren't just vehicles. They're works of art." The words lingered with Harold as he walked home. It seemed absurd, a man his age buying a car he couldn't drive. And yet the idea intrigued him. For the first time in years, Harold felt a spark of excitement, an unfamiliar yearning to do something entirely out of character. That night, Harold sat at his kitchen table with Albert's letter and his old journal spread before him. He thought about his life, the stability he had built, the adventures he had never taken, and the years he had left. The question that had lingered in his mind for days finally found an answer. The next morning, Harold made a call to the dealership. His voice trembled slightly as he spoke. "I'd like to come in and talk about that Ferrari," he said. The words felt strange and exhilarating all at once. Harold didn't know exactly what he was doing, but he knew one thing for certain. His life was about to change, and he was ready to embrace the unknown. Harold Whitmore had always been a cautious man, but stepping into the gleaming showroom of a luxury car dealership, he felt something shift. Rows of polished Ferraris, Lamborghinis, and Rolls-Royces surrounded him, exuding elegance and power. For the first time in years, Harold felt alive. "Mr. Whitmore, good to see you again," the young salesman greeted him. "Shall we talk about the Ferrari?" Harold hesitated, heart racing. He had spent the night wrestling with doubts, torn between logic and the yearning awakened by Albert's letter. But as he gazed at the cars, his doubts faded. This wasn't just about a vehicle. It was about reclaiming something he'd lost. "Yes," Harold said. "Let's talk." The salesman led him to a lounge detailing the Ferrari 296 GTB's features. Harold nodded politely, though much of the jargon went over his head. What mattered wasn't the car's horsepower or aerodynamics, but the feeling it had sparked, a long-forgotten sense of possibility. The price was staggering. Harold had never spent so much on anything. Yet, as he signed the paperwork, a surge of exhilaration coursed through him. For the first time, he was choosing something purely for himself. The Ferrari arrived 2 days later, instantly transforming Harold's modest home into a spectacle. Children gathered around the gleaming red car, their laughter filling the air. Neighbors whispered, baffled by the quiet old widower's sudden extravagance. At first, the attention unsettled Harold. He wasn't used to being noticed. Yet, as he watched the children press their faces against the car's windows, Harold felt a small, unexpected joy. The car wasn't just a possession. It was a source of connection. But Harold didn't stop there. Drawn back to the dealership, he purchased a Lamborghini Huracan, then a classic Aston Martin DB5, and finally a Rolls-Royce Phantom. His once unassuming driveway now resembled a luxury car showroom. Neighbors were mystified. Why was Harold buying cars he couldn't even drive? To Harold, the answer was simple. Each car represented a life he hadn't lived, The Ferrari was the thrill-seeker, the Lamborghini the adventurer, the Rolls-Royce the refined gentleman. For Harold, they weren't just cars, they were dreams given form. One evening, as Harold sat in his living room, the streetlights casting a glow on the cars outside, he reflected on his life. He thought of Margaret and their steady, happy years. He thought of Albert and the adventurous spirit that had inspired this change, and he thought of himself, the man he had been and the man he was becoming. Albert's words echoed, "Live a life without regret." Harold had spent so long believing his time for change had passed. Now, as he gazed at the symbols of his newfound freedom, he understood. It was never too late to begin again. Harold didn't know where this journey would lead, but he was ready to embrace it. For the first time, the future felt limitless. Harold Whitmore, a man who once prided himself on frugality, had undergone a startling transformation. What began with a single Ferrari quickly became something more. Harold found himself returning to the dealership, not out of necessity, but out of curiosity, and perhaps a touch of excitement. His second purchase was a Lamborghini Huracan, its bold orange paint and angular design a sharp contrast to Harold's modest lifestyle. On his third visit, the salesman introduced him to a classic Aston Martin DB5. Harold recognized it from old spy films and, without hesitation, added it to his collection. Each purchase left Harold feeling strangely fulfilled, as though he were reclaiming pieces of a forgotten dream. Before long, Harold's quiet home became the center of attention. His driveway, once home to a rusting bicycle, now displayed a lineup of luxury cars in vibrant hues. Neighbors whispered about the sudden change. Some thought Harold had won the lottery, others speculated about a late-life crisis. Children rode their bikes past his house just to catch a glimpse of the dazzling collection. Harold, as always, remained polite but distant. Yet he couldn't deny the quiet thrill of watching people admire his newfound treasures. For so long, Harold had blended into the background, unnoticed and unremarkable. Now he was the subject of curiosity, his choices sparking conversation and awe. But for Harold, the cars were far more than material possessions. Each one represented something intangible, a life he had never allowed himself to live. The Ferrari symbolized freedom, the Lamborghini boldness, and the Aston Martin sophistication. They weren't just vehicles, they were stories, pieces of a life Harold was beginning to rediscover. One afternoon, Harold noticed a group of teenagers lingering near his driveway. Normally, he would have ignored them, but something compelled him to call out. "Would you like a closer look?" The teens hesitated, then eagerly approached. Harold walked them through his collection, sharing what little he knew. Their enthusiasm was infectious, and for the first time in years, Harold felt a genuine connection with others. When they left, he found himself smiling, a smile that felt unfamiliar yet deeply satisfying. As the days passed, Harold's collection continued to grow. A Rolls-Royce Phantom joined the lineup, followed by a vintage Porsche 911. His driveway became a canvas of imagination and adventure, a testament to a man who had finally allowed himself to dream. One evening, Harold stood on his porch gazing at the cars illuminated by streetlights. He thought of Margaret and wondered what she would think of his newfound passion. Would she have scolded him for his extravagance? Or would she have smiled and said, "It's about time, Harold"? Harold allowed himself to believe she would have understood. Margaret had always encouraged him to step outside his comfort zone, to embrace life fully. He had resisted then, clinging to safety and routine. But now, with Albert's words echoing in his mind, Harold was finally learning to live. As Harold looked at his collection, he realized he wasn't just buying cars, he was rewriting the story of his life, one bold choice at a time. Harold Whitmore's quiet suburban street had become a buzzing hub of activity. Since his fleet of luxury cars began to grow, the once sleepy neighborhood transformed into a minor attraction. Families stopped to admire the collection during evening walks, and strangers slowed their cars to take pictures. Harold's modest driveway was now home to a Ferrari 296 GTB, Lamborghini Huracan, Aston Martin DB5, Rolls-Royce Phantom, and vintage Porsche 911. Their vibrant colors and sleek designs made his unassuming house the talk of the town. For someone who had spent his life in the background, Harold wasn't sure how to feel about his sudden fame. The rumors began quickly. Some neighbors speculated that Harold had inherited a fortune, while others imagined he had secretly been rich all along. A few dismissed the display as the result of an eccentric old man's whims. Harold listened to these theories with quiet amusement, though he couldn't entirely ignore the scrutiny. One Saturday morning, Harold noticed a group of children staring wide-eyed at the cars from the sidewalk. Their parents stood a few steps behind, murmuring among themselves. Normally, Harold might have ignored them, but this time he called out, "Would you like to take a closer look?" The children cheered, and their parents, though surprised, nodded gratefully. Harold showed them around his collection, describing the design of each car and what it meant to him. He talked less about engines and more about dreams, the freedom of the Ferrari, the boldness of the Lamborghini, the timeless elegance of the Aston Martin. By the end, Harold found himself smiling in a way he hadn't in years. The children's joy was infectious, and for a moment Harold felt truly connected to his neighbors. As word spread, more people came to see the cars. Neighbors who had never spoken to Harold stopped by to introduce themselves. Strangers, having heard of the old man with the cars, arrived to catch a glimpse. Harold, who had lived so long in solitude, found himself unexpectedly thriving in this new role. He wasn't just showing off a collection, he was sharing pieces of himself, one story at a time. Not everyone was pleased. A few neighbors grumbled about increased traffic and noise, complaining that Harold's display disrupted the street's tranquility. Harold heard their complaints but chose not to dwell on them. For the first time, he was living his life unapologetically, and he wouldn't let a few sour opinions deter him. One evening, Harold sat on his porch, sipping tea as the streetlights illuminated his collection. The cars, once symbols of personal rebellion, had become bridges to something greater. They connected Harold to a community he hadn't realized he needed. Albert's words echoed once more. "Live a life without regret." Harold smiled, watching the soft glow of the lights reflect off the cars. For the first time, he felt he was truly doing just that. Word of Harold Whitmore's car collection spread beyond his quiet suburban street. What started as neighborhood gossip quickly grew into a phenomenon. Car enthusiasts, bloggers, and journalists began arriving at Harold's once unremarkable cul-de-sac, eager to see the man whose driveway had become a spectacle. One afternoon, two young automotive vloggers knocked on Harold's door, asking to film his collection. Harold hesitated. The idea of his cars being shared online felt strange, even intrusive. But their excitement was infectious, and Harold agreed. As they filmed, they asked him questions about each vehicle. Harold, unused to sharing his thoughts, found himself talking less about the cars themselves and more about the freedom, adventure, and boldness they represented to him. When the video went live, Harold was stunned by the response. Thousands of viewers left comments praising his courage to embrace life in his later years. Many shared their own dreams, inspired by Harold's decision to live without regret. For someone who had spent so much of his life in the background, Harold was astonished to find himself at the center of something so meaningful. More visitors followed. A local journalist wrote a feature about Harold, dubbing him the man who bought his dreams. Classic car enthusiasts invited him to join their clubs. Though Harold wasn't interested in meetings, he appreciated the invitations. One father brought his young son, a car enthusiast, to see Harold's collection. Harold gave them a tour, watching with quiet joy as the boy's eyes lit up. For Harold, the attention was both overwhelming and deeply rewarding. After decades of solitude, connecting with others felt strange but satisfying. The cars, once symbols of personal rebellion, had become a bridge to the world, sparking conversations and connections Harold never thought he'd have. Not everyone was pleased. A few neighbors grumbled about increased traffic, annoyed by the stream of visitors. One particularly vocal resident accused Harold of being selfish, disrupting the street's tranquility. Harold, always considerate, felt a flicker of guilt but reminded himself of Albert's words, "Live a life without regret." He resolved not to let the negativity overshadow the joy his choices had brought him. One evening, as Harold admired the cars in the glow of the streetlights, a young woman approached him. She introduced herself as a filmmaker creating a documentary about people who reinvent themselves later in life. She had heard about Harold's story and wanted to include him in her project. Harold, though initially reluctant, agreed. During the interview, the filmmaker asked, "What do these cars mean to you?" Harold paused, then said, "They're not just cars. They're pieces of the life I never thought I'd have. They remind me that it's never too late to start living." The filmmaker smiled, visibly moved by his words. That night, as Harold watched her pack up her equipment, he reflected on how far he had come. Once a man of quiet routines, Harold was now sharing his story with the world. He didn't know where this journey would lead next, but for the first time, Harold felt no fear, only anticipation. Harold Whitmore's growing fame left many wondering, why luxury cars? The Harold they had known was practical, modest, uninterested in extravagance. Yet now, his driveway gleamed with vehicles that seemed entirely out of character. At first, Harold didn't have an answer. The cars began as rebellion, a way to escape years of routine. But as his collection grew, Harold realized each car represented more than indulgence. They were symbols of a life he had only dared to dream. The Ferrari 296 GTB embodied freedom, breaking away from expectations. The Lamborghini Huracan was boldness, the daring Harold had kept buried. The Aston Martin DB5, timeless and elegant, reflected a sophistication Harold admired but had never embraced. Each car was a piece of an unwritten story, a fragment of the man Harold had always wanted to be. One afternoon, Harold rummaged through old keepsakes in his attic. Among faded photographs, he found a childhood drawing of a sports car. It was rough and simple, yet it stirred something in him. As a boy, Harold had dreamed of speed and adventure, but practicality had pulled him away. His mother's warnings, Margaret's steady caution, and his own fear of failure had quietly smothered those aspirations. Now, Harold saw the cars as more than possessions. They were keys, unlocking the parts of himself he thought were gone. The boy sketching dreams in the margins of his notebooks, the young man imagining road trips, and the widower who had let his life grow small. Each car reminded him it was never too late to reclaim those pieces. This realization brought Harold peace. For years he had believed it was too late to change, that dreams were for the young. But the cars proved otherwise. They weren't about wealth or status. They were about courage, freedom, and the joy of living boldly. The collection also began inspiring others. Visitors and neighbors shared their own stories. A young boy told Harold he wanted to design cars someday, his eyes lighting up as he stared at the Ferrari. A father admitted he had let his own dreams slip away but now felt inspired to try again. Harold saw that the cars, once personal symbols, had become something greater, a reminder that reinvention was possible at any age. One evening, Harold sat in the driver's seat of the Ferrari as the sun set, its golden light spilling over the dashboard. He imagined himself as a young man, driving across the country, stopping in small towns, meeting new people. He smiled, knowing that while he might never take such a trip, its spirit was alive in his choices now. Albert's words echoed, "Live a life without regret." For so long, Harold thought those words were for someone else. Now he knew they had always been for him. The next morning, Harold began writing a letter, not to anyone in particular, but to capture his thoughts. "The cars," he wrote, "aren't about what I own. They're about what I've reclaimed. Proof that it's never too late to begin again." For Harold, the cars were no longer just possessions. They were reflections of a life finally lived on his terms. Harold Whitmore sat in his living room, the late afternoon sun glinting off the polished cars outside. Each vehicle told a story, reflecting the man Harold had become. But now, a new thought stirred in his mind, a thought that felt both exciting and daunting. For weeks, Harold had been receiving letters from people inspired by his journey. One letter, from a young man dreaming of becoming an automotive engineer but unable to afford tuition, stayed with him. The cars had helped Harold reclaim his sense of self. What if they could help others as well? That evening, Harold made a decision. He called a local auction house. "I'd like to auction my car collection," he said. The words felt strange but deeply right. The cars had served their purpose. Now, they could create opportunities for others. News of Harold's decision spread quickly, sparking a wave of curiosity and admiration. Journalists, car enthusiasts, and even his neighbors marveled at the audacity of auctioning such a collection. Harold, however, remained grounded. This wasn't about attention. It was about honoring Albert's legacy by giving others a chance to follow their dreams. On the day of the auction, the cars were transported to a grand hall, their sleek exteriors gleaming under the lights. Harold stood at the back of the room, quietly observing as bidders arrived. Wealthy collectors, curious onlookers, and even a few familiar faces from his neighborhood. Before the bidding began, the auctioneer invited Harold to speak. Harold hesitated but stepped forward, his voice steady. "These cars aren't just machines," he said. "They're dreams. They've reminded me of the life I wanted to live, and I hope they'll inspire the same in those who take them home." The room erupted in applause, and Harold returned to his seat, his heart pounding. As the auction unfolded, Harold watched each car sell for far more than he'd ever anticipated. The Ferrari, the Lamborghini, the Aston Martin, all found new homes. Yet, as they were wheeled away, Harold didn't feel sadness. Instead, he felt a profound sense of fulfillment. The proceeds, he knew, would go toward something meaningful. By the end of the day, Harold's collection had been transformed into a fund dedicated to scholarships, community projects, and grants for young dreamers. It was his way of honoring Albert's gift by passing it forward. Walking home that evening, Harold glanced at his now empty driveway. The absence of the cars, once a centerpiece of his transformation, didn't feel like a loss. Instead, it felt like a new beginning. Later that night, Harold sat down to write one final letter. "The cars gave me a second chance," he wrote. "Now, I hope they'll do the same for others. It's never too late to make a difference, not just for yourself, but for the world." Folding the letter, Harold placed it in a drawer. He felt ready for whatever came next, knowing that his extraordinary journey was far from over. The morning after the auction, Harold Whitmore sat at his kitchen table, staring at the envelope containing the proceeds. The amount was staggering, but Harold's focus wasn't on the money. It was on what it could do. Albert's gift had changed his life, and Harold was determined to pay it forward. Harold established the Whitmore Foundation, dedicated to funding scholarships, small business grants, and community projects. Applications poured in. Students hoping for college, entrepreneurs dreaming of a fresh start, and artists yearning to create. Harold, who had lived much of his life in solitude, now found himself at the center of something extraordinary. One scholarship went to Clara, a young woman who dreamed of becoming an engineer. When Harold met her, her determination was unmistakable. "I've always wanted to build things," she said, her voice filled with hope. Another grant went to a single mother opening a bakery. Harold attended her shop's opening day, watching as her children beamed with pride. Letters from recipients began arriving, each one a testament to the foundation's impact. A young architect wrote, "Your gift didn't just change my life. It made me believe in myself." Harold carefully stored these letters in a drawer, each one a reminder of the lives the cars had touched. The ripples of Harold's decisions spread farther than he could have imagined. A struggling artist used a grant to open her first gallery. A community park funded by the foundation became a hub for families. Harold often walked through the park, watching children play and parents laugh, feeling a quiet satisfaction. Harold's own life transformed as well. The solitude he had once embraced gave way to connection. People who had once been strangers visited to share their stories and thank him. Harold listened, his heart swelling with humility and pride. The cars, once symbols of personal freedom, had become bridges to a community Harold hadn't realized he needed. One afternoon, Harold received a package in the mail. Inside was a hand-carved model of a Ferrari, painted the same red as the one he had auctioned. It came with a note from Clara, the engineering student. "You gave me a future. This is a reminder of the dreams you've made possible." Harold held the model in his hands, tears brimming in his eyes. Albert's words echoed in Harold's mind. "Live a life without regret." For so long, Harold had believed those words were meant for the bold and daring. But now, as he saw the lives his choices had touched, he understood their deeper meaning. Living without regret wasn't about extravagance. It was about making choices that mattered. One evening, Harold sat on his porch watching the sunset. The driveway that had once been filled with luxury cars was empty, but Harold didn't feel a sense of loss. Their legacy lived on in the lives they had changed. For the first time, Harold felt he had truly lived a life worth remembering. Harold Whitmore awoke to soft morning light streaming through his window. Months had passed since the auction, and his days had taken on a peaceful rhythm. The cars were gone, but in their place was something far more meaningful: purpose. The Whitmore Foundation had grown beyond Harold's expectations. Each day brought news of its impact: a scholarship recipient excelling in school, a community park thriving with families, a new bakery opening its doors. Harold, once content to live quietly in the background, now felt a part of something extraordinary. His home, once a retreat of solitude, had become a place of connection. Visitors stopped by to share updates or express their gratitude. Harold welcomed these moments, finding joy in the stories of others. It wasn't what he had owned, but what he had given that now mattered most. One day, Harold received an invitation from Clara, the engineering student whose scholarship had helped her attend university. She was graduating and wanted Harold at her ceremony. Though traveling felt daunting, Harold couldn't refuse. Clara's journey symbolized everything the foundation stood for. On the day of the ceremony, Harold sat among proud families. When Clara's name was called, Harold watched her cross the stage, her face glowing with pride. As she turned and smiled at him, Harold felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. He hadn't just changed his own life, he had helped change others. After the ceremony, Clara introduced Harold to her family, speaking of him with admiration. Harold, humbled, said, "You deserve the credit. I only opened the door. You walked through it." That evening, Harold returned home and sat on his porch, reflecting on his journey. The boy who had once dreamed of adventure, the man who had lived quietly, the widower who thought his best days were behind him, all had led to this moment. Albert's words echoed in his mind: "Live a life without regret." Harold had once believed those words required bold adventures. Now he understood their true meaning. Living without regret was about leaving a legacy in the lives of others. Picking up his pen, Harold wrote in his notebook, "My life has been a series of quiet choices, but in those choices I've found my voice. The cars, the foundation, the people, they've shown me it's never too late to live fully and give freely." Setting down the pen, Harold looked out at the quiet street, his heart at peace. His legacy wasn't in the cars he had owned, but in the lives he had touched. For the first time, Harold truly understood the value of Albert's gift and his own journey. With a smile, Harold leaned back in his chair, the scent of blooming flowers carried on a soft breeze. His extraordinary journey had brought him to a place of contentment. Harold Whitmore had lived a life without regret.